Good morning, everybody. Hello and welcome to our first virtual travel event. I'm Amy Virshup, travel editor for the New York Times. And today we're going to Zambia and beyond with the photographer Marcus Westberg. Marcus, welcome and thank you for doing this with us. A quick housekeeping note before we begin. We're going to show you some incredible photos from Marcus and chat about his process and get some behind the scene details. And then we want to turn to questions from you, the viewers. You can use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit your questions, and we'll get to them in about 20 minutes or so. Please note that this event is being recorded, and let's get started. So Marcus, this is you. Where are you in this picture?
This is in Kwai in northern Botswana. And that's my wife.
And the elephants just like hang out like that with you.
They just hang out like that.
It's pretty incredible. So, you know, we're going to look at a lot of photographs here from Africa, but other places as well. And one of the things I want to ask you about is how you got interested in Africa. I know in the piece that we ran in the travel section, you talk about going there first when you were 23 years old to shoot in Zambia. So tell me, how does a guy from Sweden end up becoming such a photographer of African wildlife?
Well, I went to Kenya as a kid as well, actually.
Okay.
And so that was my first introduction to Africa. I came back in 2006, so that was my first time as an adult. I wasn't a photographer at all, but it was when I got interested in photography. I met a wildlife photographer in Malawi who impressed me a lot. And then I spent 3 weeks in South Luangwa, camped up a tree platform and saw a lot of wildlife. And then I became a truly awful photographer for many years, but luckily I didn't realize that until much later. And so I thought I was quite good, and I kept it up. And I have a degree in conservation from Tasmania. And while I was there, I organized to do my thesis research in Kenya. And because I thought I had a real shot of making it as a photographer, I bought a lot of gear and I brought it with me. And then luckily I turned into a quite good photographer while I was there.
Now, what was the difference between you as a quite bad photographer and you as a quite good photographer? What changed?
I have no idea, but it took me a while to realize, but see, I went back to Tasmania in 2014 and I was doing a story on Tasmania for a Swedish travel magazine. And I thought, oh, that's great. I spent 3 years there. I photographed quite a lot when I was there. So I probably have quite a lot of images already that I can use. And then I spent a couple of days going through my hard drives and all my old photos. And I found 2 from 3 years that I thought, if I have to, I can probably get away with using these. So whatever changed, it was for the better, which is nice. But then, photography, of course, you keep developing as you go. And the beauty with digital photography is even when you do really bad processing, you don't ruin your shots. So you can go back a few years later when you've hopefully matured a bit and, tone down the saturation or whatever it was that you got wrong in the first place.
So let's talk about how you're shooting these animals. Most of the time I've been on safari, my photos don't look like this. And most of the time when we do see animals in the wild, we're not getting, this intimate sense with them, especially say like the big cats, elephants, maybe you do get fairly close to that and you see them up close, but like the big cats with their kittens and things like that. How are you shooting those? How are you getting that in tight with those animals? Like this guy we're looking at right there.
Look, it depends. Obviously as a wildlife photographer, I do have some quite big lenses, but not all the photos are taken with them, of course. Intimacy for me is not necessarily about how close you get, but the feeling that you can create, right? I mean, even if you don't actually have a connection with the animal, if you feel that you have a connection, and if you can get the person looking at your pictures to feel like they have a connection with that animal, that's really what to go for. And in some cases that might mean using wide angle lenses, either because the animals come close. Most places, of course, will have rules about how close you can get. And there will be times when even if the animals approach you, you should really back off. But sometimes if you spend enough time in an area and you just let the animals do their thing, of course they will come closer. And the bigger the animal, the farther away you can be, as you say, with elephants, and still get some kind of feeling of intimacy.
And have you been in dangerous spots? Because some of these animals are dangerous animals. They're not, and they're wild. They're not, pets.
Yeah,
Tiger
they
King,
are.
Tiger King to the contrary, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, not keeping them as pets helps. So try to avoid that. No, look, of course there are stories, but generally speaking, I think if you're respectful and you're not overconfident, then you can avoid most situations like that. And that's not necessarily relying on your own common sense, but the common sense of the guides you're with, for example. And it's also about respecting them. A lot of people get carried away when they're close to wildlife because they want to get a bit closer. They want to, they want to get the best possible shot. But it's not just the safety of you that's at stake. It's not just the safety of the animals. There's also thousands of jobs, right? If you misbehave in a park and you do something really stupid and you get yourself injured or killed, that's not just bad for you. That's, it also risks killing tourism in the area, and that's a lot of families who can't necessarily support themselves, and it might also have negative impacts on the animals. They might have to shoot whichever animal it was through no fault of that animal. So yeah, I mean, of course, sometimes there are situations where you get goosebumps, but it's not, for me, it hasn't been so much because I place myself in danger, and it's more, waking up in your tent in the middle of the night and hearing a lion roar right outside, and you're not in danger, but it's still, it makes you feel very alive.
Right. Now, are there, you went to Zambia and wrote about it for us, and in the slideshow, do you have a favorite country? Is that your favorite country, or are there, or a favorite place that you've ever shot?
No, I mean, I have to say that's probably one of the more difficult questions to get. I'm a big fan of two regions of the world in particular, and that's sub-Saharan Africa. Mostly the drier areas. I don't do so well in rainforests, and then the Arctic. I love being up in Lapland and Svalbard, and lots of ice and kind of stark landscapes. But within Africa, I mean, I've worked in about 20 or 22 countries in Africa over the years. And there are specific places that I love, but then once you've been there for a few weeks, it's really nice to have some variety. I've spent a lot of time working with gorillas in both Congos and in Uganda and Rwanda, and that's great, but it's a lot of hiking around with heavy gear and a lot of sweating because it's more tropical. So after a few weeks of that, as wonderful as it is, I'm really happy to be out on the savannah. And then after that, I probably feel like I need to spend time with people. So I'm not just, I do a lot of wildlife work, but a lot of it is more conservation focused, and that means working with nonprofit organizations and governments, and that gives a bit of interaction, which is nice. And then sometimes it's more straightforward travel pieces, and it's nice to mix it up. I love being out in nature, but it's nice to have company sometimes.
And you're talking about like using big lenses and that kind of thing. What kind of equipment are you carrying with you on these trips?
Lots. I know that there are some photographers who feel that the less you have, the better, and that in some ways that you almost should be able to handle having just a single camera and a single lens. And I'm very happy for them. That must be nice for your neck and your back. I'm not one of them. Because I tend to shoot quite a wide range of things. I always have several cameras, and I have everything from very wide angle lenses to 600 millimeter lenses, depending on the job. If there's no wildlife involved, then not the really big stuff. But yeah, it's a lot. My hand luggage is way heavier than it's allowed to be for any flight, and so it's always the most stressful moment of any trip is checking in at the airport and just hoping that they're not going to ask you away your hand luggage, because you really don't want to send all your gear through check-in luggage. So.
Right. When you're shooting in the polar regions, shooting the Northern Lights, I went and did a Northern Lights trip this year myself, and I will tell you that my Northern Lights photos do not look like yours. So is that just luck that you're out on a night when the activity is really high, or how is that? How do you do that?
No, it's a combination. I mean, of course, you need luck. So my wife and I, we were up twice in Lapland this year during the winter, and it's really not a good year for Northern Lights, and the weather wasn't good either. So the first trip we saw Northern Lights once on 10 days, and the second time a bit more, but never very strong. So I mean, yeah, of course, luck in that sense, or planning for it and then hoping for the best is important. But then having the right equipment to be able to do long exposure photography, and then being willing to stay out all night after night after night, of course, helps.
Right. So those pictures that we saw of the Northern Lights, you might have been there days waiting for a high activity level. Yeah.
So the first time I went up north to photograph Northern Lights, amongst other things, I was quite lucky. It was a really good year for it. So probably every second night that I was out, we had really good lights. I didn't actually plan the trip after that. We went to a few different places out in the middle of national parks most of the time, and just happened to have really good lights. And now this time was different. So we made sure, I think in total we spent about 3.5 weeks in Lapland doing other things as well. But then every night just keeping an eye on the apps and on the sky, and then rushing out if it looked like there was likely to become something good.
Wow. All right. So we're going to look at some other photos now. We have a small group of photos that we wanted to look at where we would talk specifically about them. And I think they're going to get loaded up. But one of them is of an extraordinary bird called the lilac-breasted roller. And tell me what it's like. How do you shoot birds? I mean, birds seem particularly difficult to me because they're usually, I mean, some of them are big, but this is not a big bird. There we go. Here he is. So how did you get this guy? And actually,
yeah.
Let me say one other thing. I often hear photographers say they didn't get photos, they didn't take photos, they make photos. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit as well.
I've never really thought of it in quite those terms, to be honest.
Okay.
I've never gotten really into the debate either about art versus documentary. I mean, I think it depends a lot on who you're shooting for, as in the audience you're shooting for. It depends. Are you doing this to get a fine art print, or are you doing it for a magazine article, or if you're submitting it to wildlife photography competitions or press competitions, then the criteria are very different from if it's something a bit more creative. I'm not sure if that answered what you're asking, but I don't. Yeah, I'm not sure if I see myself as an artist or as somebody who documents things. I try to share what I see with people, and that's about as far as I've thought of that particular aspect of it. Okay. As far as bird photography, I'm not in any way a specialized bird photographer. So I'm a very opportunistic bird photographer. I like birds, and I think the more time I've spent in the bush, the more you grow fond of them, because oftentimes they're very beautiful up close, and they tend to always do something. And when you've seen I know that might sound spoiled for people who don't get to spend so much time in the bush, but once you've seen lions 100 times and most of the time they're sleeping, you start getting more and more interested in the small things that are actually moving around a lot more. So this particular photo, I mean, most of the bird shots that I have are with whatever the biggest lens I happen to have with me at the time. So I think this was 600mm or 500mm lens with an extender on it. Rollers you can sometimes get fairly close to. They're quite common in South Luangwa, so this is by no means the only attempt that I've made over the years. I probably have a couple of hundred photos of rollers from different occasions. It's my wife's favorite bird as well. So every time we see one, it's like, Marcus, take a picture of it. So, and I think over the years, I've got one decent picture of one flying, and that's it, because I don't set out specifically to do this. In general, it tends to be like that for me. I'm less concerned with which individual animal it is that I'm going to photograph, and I like taking pictures that speak to people, whether that's an intimate moment or of a place that I find particularly beautiful. So I'm not really into pictures of hunts and kills and things like that. It's fun and it's interesting to see it. It's a part of life, but it's not something that I focus on that much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then if we go to the next one here, I think we have some hippos we want to look at. Right.
Yeah. So we have a few photographs here from the Luangwa Valley in Zambia that were in the article. And I thought it would be a good way to preempt some of the questions that will probably come up in terms of a little bit what we talked about already, what it takes to photograph wildlife and so on. And so we have 3 slides here to show 3 fairly different aspects of this, because you do tend to get questions, right? Is it luck? How much of it is that you spend weeks and weeks out in the bush? So this picture, if we go back to the hippos, the hippo shot is a great example of just patience and spending a lot of time waiting. So this is in Luambe National Park, which is next to South Luangwa. And this was just outside the camp where I was staying. And I must have just sat on a chair with a tripod and the camera every sunset for, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 days before I got this shot. I have thousands and thousands of hippo shots from those days. And just, sooner or later, you're going to get lucky, hopefully. And then you just have to be ready and be there for it. And then the giraffe shots that we can come to next.
Yeah, so the giraffe was, the giraffe on the left, where you see him or her, I'm not sure whether that's a male or female, was one of the most popular photographs in the photo essay you did for us online. People just loved it. So how do you get that moment?
Yeah, so and it's actually the same giraffe here. That's why I included both photos, and also because it needs to be 16:9, and that shot was taken in the wrong direction, so it needed a second one to go with it. So this is another aspect of it, and that's hard work. So this these photos both look quite serene. The behind the scenes part wasn't. I was running around trying to, hand holding a 600mm lens, trying to get into the right position, and my friend that I was with was keeping an eye out for other animals and just kind of following next to me in the car. And I was sweating like crazy. And we'd been out trying to do this for a couple of days. And so, it looks very calm. And the giraffe was perfectly calm, but I wasn't necessarily. So that is another aspect. Sometimes it's not, you do have to work for it, of course.
So you had this idea in your head that you could get a giraffe silhouetted against the sunset?
Right, yeah, so the picture on the right was actually the one that I was going for. That was the idea I'd had, and then I exposed it a bit differently from different positions, and the one on the left turned out to be really nice as well. But
okay.
Yeah, I had an obsession for a year or two with getting things silhouetted by the setting sun, and so I have all kinds of pictures of elephants and rollers and whatnot, and this one just happened to work out.
Okay. And then we have an elephant that was one of my favorites. There we go. So this guy.
Yeah, so now we're getting on to the luck aspect, because that's of course also a huge part of wildlife photography. You can't control the animals, and so you have to be prepared. The more time you spend out there, the easier, of course, to be lucky. But in this case, the first shots we got of this guy. So this behavior that you're seeing here is not that common. You see it more in mana pools in Zimbabwe, but sometimes in South Luangwa. I've only seen it as one time, and we were driving past when we saw this happen. And so the first shots, we didn't even have time to move the car or change the lens. So the first ones were cropped in a bit of a weird way because there was just no time. And then once he went down and went back up, we managed to back up a little bit so that I didn't get only half of him in the shot. But of course, luck really, you can't choose the sightings you're going to have. You you can impact the chances you're going to have by how much time you spend there, by either learning about behavior yourself or being with good guides, which is of course much easier because they'll know the parks. But then you just have to be lucky, and that's part of it.
That's great. I love this picture. And then, you trained in conservation. So a lot of what you're doing is going out and documenting conservation, right? And working with people who are working to save the animals and keep them healthy. And also, making sure that the people who live in these places are benefiting from our coming to see these animals, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Those, and we can go to the next slide for that, I think. Yeah. And
who are you here? Who are you with here?
So this is a project based in South Luangwa, or based in Zambia, I should say. They work in 3 different parks called the Zambian Carnivore program. And I spent 4 or 5 days working with them the last time I was in Zambia in 2018. And so I wanted to include them for a few different reasons. One is that, of course, when we're talking about access and certain kinds of photographs, there is a difference going as a tourist than if you are working in the field, of course, which is also why some of the pictures that they will have, even though they don't necessarily have photographers, but the access you have when you're working in a park every single day is different. But you're right, this is also a very important part of wildlife tourism. And there's been a lot of talk now in the last few weeks with international travel largely having stopped and people staying at home, about a lot of positive impacts on the environment, right? Cleaner air, cleaner water, and that's absolutely true. But it's equally true that in places like South Luangwa, the wildlife and the people there depend very heavily on tourism. So it's a fine balance, and it depends very much on where you are. And so these guys, for example, who work together with the Department of National Parks and Wildlife to do anti-poaching and research, the money in both for the government through park fees and for them largely comes through tourism donations. And so no tourism this year is going to create a lot of problems both for them and for a lot of the camps and lodges, who are of course the largest employers in the area. So it's a tricky situation, but and this, it does also mean that it's extra important now to not forget about them, because they'll still need financial support. The poaching has gone up already in various places because the money is just not coming in at the moment when there's no tourism.
Right. I know the people working here are young women, and how many women are involved in conservation now? Is it becoming more common for African women?
Yeah, it is becoming more common, and there are some initiatives that focus specifically on that. So there's, for example, I think in Zimbabwe, there's a team of all-female rangers with the Zambia Carnivore program. They're not all women, but one of the women in these pictures, Tandiwe, she's quite an amazing person, and so she went through another project, Chipimbele, and got scholarships, and then got taken on by the Zambia Carnivore program, and has now started a few years ago herself a program for getting more local women into conservation in this area. So no, for sure, there is more and more of it. Great, which is really nice.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, so I think we are now going to open this up and go to some of the viewer questions. And I think what we'll do is, as we're talking, we'll see some of Marcus's photographs again, give you another chance to look at them. And I'm going to pull up the reader questions now, and I'll start asking them. Hang on. Okay, so we have a viewer named Mikey P, and he wants to know what makes Zambia such a special place.
I'd say a combination of a couple of things. So it is a really spectacular destination for wildlife, but partly because there hasn't been as much money pumped into promoting tourism from a government side internationally compared to places like Kenya and South Africa and Tanzania. It's just flown under the radar a bit, and so you don't get the same crowds that you might end up with in some of the more well-known places. And that even goes for South Luangwa, which is by far the best known park in Zambia. But you know, really, once you get away from the main gate area, you just don't see that many people, and they're very good at maintaining rules about maximum number of cars at sightings and so on. And then, and I know it's a generalization, but I really enjoy the people in Zambia and in Malawi, for example. It's not to say that people aren't friendly in other places, but Zambia has always been a bit of a standout. So, and I mean, for me, of course, it was the first time that I spent a longer period of time in the bush in Africa. And so, you know, I kind of fell in love with South Luangwa the first time, and then you get to know people, you get to know the place, you come back again, you meet more people. And you know, I'd say that part is significant as well, but it really is, you know, it's a country that should be visited more than it is, because it really does have some very spectacular places.
Great. Max asks, what areas around the world are still on your wish list, either in terms of casual travel or more specifically for your work? Are there places you haven't gone yet that you really want to go?
Look, I haven't been to South America, for example, so that's a pretty huge place to on the wish list. Yeah, so there's lots. So you know, there's two sides to this, right? Because as you go somewhere, you tend to also see how much there's still to see in that place. So a lot of the places where I've worked in Africa, so like Zambia, Malawi, Uganda, Congo, Kenya, I've been 6, 7, 8 times. But you know, it never feels like the same trip, because you know, even in Zambia, there's a lot of national parks that I haven't been to yet. So there's always that sense of wanting to, yeah, okay, you know, you hear about new places, you want to go there, but then you also feel like, well, I'd really like to see this place in the rainy season, so maybe I need to try to get back, you know, for that. But outside of Africa and outside of South America, I'd just like to see more of different areas in the Arctic. I think I've been to Svalbard a couple of times. I've been to northern Sweden a bit, but the Arctic is really, I grew up in the north for the first few years of my life, and yeah, I'm just a big fan.
Yeah. Okay, we let's see. A reader or viewer who didn't share his name or her name asked, how do you handle permissions when you're taking pictures of people? Do you ask them beforehand, is it okay if I shoot you? Or do you just go ahead and shoot and, you know, ask them later if it's all right?
So it's very rare that I photograph people without them knowing that I photographed them, and it's partly to do with permission, but not so much. It's more for me that I you know, the reason I do what I do is because I like forming connections, and I like passing that on or trying to forge connections. And that's very hard to do if you're photographing someone who doesn't know that they're being photographed, you know, because there is no connection then to transfer or to communicate to whoever's looking at the photographs later. That's a lot of the time it's facilitated by the fact that I'm often working with projects, right? So if I go to a school, I don't rock up at a school by myself. I tend to go there with, for example, like the Zambia Carnivore program, or with African Parks, or another organization that's funding the school or providing conservation education in the school. And so I would get introduced first, you know, I'll play around with the kids, I'll let them use the cameras. And, you know, to be honest, most of them enjoy being photographed. But then it also depends on what I would use the photographs for. So I sell prints on my website, but I don't sell any prints of people. There's no legal impediment to doing that, but I'm just not comfortable with that. It's different if you're photographing for stories, right? For magazine articles and so on, because sometimes you do need to photograph people without them knowing. And I don't think there's necessarily a great solution for figuring out permissions and so on, because a lot of moments would of course get ruined if you go up and tell them that you're about to photograph them. But again, I don't tend to do that very often. I like spending a lot of time in the same place. So when I've gone on assignment for example, New York Times, I've tended to stay much longer than what photographers would usually do, right? I might only get paid for a certain number of days, but then I will want to stay longer anyway, because I feel like I need to have that time to be able to connect with people properly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have a question from Emilio. What percentage of a great photo is technique? And what percentage is the way the photographer understands the photo? So maybe that's technique versus the emotional connection in the photo.
Yeah, or maybe intuitive things versus how much of it is actual technical details. I'm not sure. I think it depends, first of all, on what you consider to be a great photograph for a start. I think, what I would say is that you need to have a fairly solid base of good technique in your photograph, right? Because if it's not sharp, or if it's not the right moment, then that will be very obvious, and it won't be a great photograph. But then beyond that, again, it depends from photographer to photographer. For me, so much of it is about the feeling, right? The atmosphere and the connection that you can communicate, and that's probably largely intuitive. I mean, I'm sure there are rules you can follow to improve the chances of doing that, but a lot of it is about what you're feeling and trying to capture what you're feeling. And then of course it comes with experience as well. I photograph very differently now. I saw another question about that ties into this, right? About how many photographs do you take, for each one that gets published. And I think that goes up and down as well. When you're starting out, you just photograph everything in every moment. And sometimes when I'm out on a game drive and I see someone else in another car, and I swear they must take like 15, 20,000 photographs in a single day. Now, I don't do that. I think when you get more experience, you choose your moments a little bit more than in the beginning. And, you also learn when to put the camera down, right? Now, I don't feel that I can't experience the moment properly if I'm photographing. But if I am somewhere and the circumstances are such that I don't think this is going to be a great image, then I'd rather put the camera down and just enjoy the moment. If I'm only going to get a half decent shot, then I may as well just give it a rest for a while.
Just, the idea of shooting that many thousands of pictures, I mean, that's only possible because of digital photography. Did you ever shoot on film, or did you start out with digital? I
had a normal SLR when I was in my mid-teens that I used for a little while. So that was my first foray into photography. But I don't even talk about it because it was just, I was pointing and shooting and I enjoyed it. I did it for probably a year or two and then put it away and didn't use it until a trip to Mexico when I broke it on like the third day. So that was the end of my analog days.
All right, we have, Emily asks, do ostriches really stick their heads in the ground?
No, as far as I know, no, certainly not when they're afraid. They're quite fast runners. I've never photographed one with its head in the ground, at least.
Chody asks, she grew up in Zambia and she loves the South Luangwa National Park and says, thank you for your gorgeous photos. She wanted to, this was a question about how do you deal with consent when shooting local children in various cultures. So usually the children are part of a program that that they know you're there and their parents know that you're there, right?
Yeah, or at least their teachers would know that they're there. It's also, I mean, so sometimes you get people who will worry about things like this, right? About having their picture taken. It's usually based on assumptions that aren't true, right? That you're going to sell their picture to, I don't know, syndicates, or you're going to get really rich of selling pictures of these people, which, no photographer gets particularly rich from anything anyway. But yeah, again, I'd be, if I meet a group of kids on the street, yeah, I will photograph them, but probably I would just photograph them to be able to share the picture with them. I often travel with a Polaroid camera for the same reason, and depending on how remote the area you're in, it could very well be that it's the adults who really would love to have a picture of themselves, right? Because the only printed photo they have of themselves might be in an ID card and nothing else. So having that is really fun. It also makes it more of an exchange. And, you know, I think that that part is actually really important. Now, whether it's a photograph or it's just taking the time to get to know someone and to talk if you speak the same language. Otherwise, I mean, I dance a lot with kids, right? If there's music going around, just because it gets people to relax. I would dance with adults as well, but they, you know, don't dance as much with me. But I think that's really important. And you know, my wife and I would guide trips, and it's the same thing. You really want encounters to be encounters for everyone, not just for you, right? Whether you're a tourist or there to work, it wouldn't feel right if most of the time I felt like I was coming out of it richer for the experience, but whoever I met didn't. Right? And so, yeah, we'll come out of it with different things. But at least I would prefer if people feel like, oh, that kind of brightened my day a little bit, you know, which is also why I hand out my camera sometimes and just let people try to take pictures of me, because it's not something that they will have done, and it kind of evens out the field a little bit.
Right. Okay. Eric asks about, he says, Zambia has the largest animal migration in the world, which is 10 million fruit bats. Have you ever shot the fruit bats?
No, I haven't. Yeah, so they travel between a small park in Zambia and Congo. But the problem is that they arrive as the rainy season starts, and you know, for obvious reasons, it's not the best time to do a lot of other types of photography. And Zambia being quite far away, I haven't made my way over for that specifically yet. But yeah, it's definitely, if we go back to the kind of wish list of things to see, and of course photograph, but just to experience it, that would definitely be up there.
All right. Sophie asks, what are your tips for a current college student to get involved in this sort of career?
Well, so like I said before, my career wasn't photography, right? And in a way, I think it's quite helpful to have something else. So I came into this through conservation. So when I went to Kenya, which again, I mean, it took me 2 years to organize to do my thesis there. So I was pretty determined to be able to spend the time there. And then when I arrived, I got in touch with a whole bunch of different conservation organizations around the Mara. And I told them that, look, I'm going to be here. I'm doing this. I can take pictures. I've got time on my hands. So if you need help with anything, just let me know. And I ended up working with a few of them. And one of them got me published in Nat Geo on their website, because she was a National Geographic Explorer at the time. And, you know, so I kind of came in the back door, and it's not the only way to do it, but it's helpful, because you know, there's a lot of, especially if you're working places like that, because there's just so many people who, even if they don't necessarily want to become professional photographers, have cameras and the money to travel, right? The other thing I would say is to start local with everything. And in a way, I think the current situation, if we disregard for a second the fact that, you know, a lot of the projects and places like South Luangwa would need tourism to survive. But it is, I think, also positive in that it might make us appreciate where we are more, both in terms of you know, projects that we can work with, but also just that we tend to be more excited about going abroad than staying home. But if you're going to start, you know, if you're looking at a career in photography, you've got a better chance of building a more diverse portfolio if there's somewhere that you can visit again and again and again. You know, yeah, lions are cool and elephants are beautiful, but a lot of people go on safari, and the odds that you on that one trip are going to be able to build a portfolio that's really spectacular enough compared to what other people who are spending all of their time there are already doing, that's tough. But you find something near where you live, and I'm sure, Amy, that you would probably say something similar as a travel editor, right? You need to look for something that's a different take on a story, and your chances are much better if you can really get to know the people, get to know the project, visit different seasons, different times of the day.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing we actually, since I've been travel editor, we are in fact trying to use more people to write about the place that they live, as opposed to like having someone parachute in. And part of that, I think, is the more steeped you are in a place, the more authentically you can represent it. And people, I think, really respond to that authenticity. Like the idea of, I'm going to just jump in here and then show you what this place is. Well, you need to really understand the place in order to show it, right? And to show it authentically. Okay, let's see. Margetta asks about your conservation work and what some of the obstacles to conservation are in Africa, and also whether overall, are you hopeful about conservation in Africa?
Yeah, I'm generally a fairly hopeful person, right? One of the reactions I got from New York Times when I sent in a profile picture, it's like, oh, you look so happy in the picture, and I was like, yeah, well, I think I'm just generally a pretty happy person. But I think that, you know, it's not an optimism that comes from being naive. I mean, there are huge issues depending on where you are, but you know, with financing, with corruption, with poaching, with all kinds of things. But what I like about working with different projects is you meet people who are passionate and who are very determined and who enjoy spending time in schools with kids, and the influence that it has on them, as especially if you're talking about, you know, local, like with the pictures we looked at before, at local women. I mean, that's a great role model for young girls in those schools. And so I think there is a lot to be optimistic about. One of the biggest problems is there's almost a complete reliance in most of the places that we'd be talking about on outside financing, right? Either through tourism directly or through donors. And in some ways it's great because it means that you don't rely on a government department having enough money to focus on certain questions. But like we're seeing right now, it also makes you very, very vulnerable to, you know, shifts in politics or the market, or if there's a pandemic and people can't travel anymore, right? If you lose a whole season and all the camps are closed and nobody's visiting the park, and the park fees is how you're financing all these things, then you've got a problem. So, you know, there is a real need to, I think, to and I don't have an answer for how that would work, but there is a need to diversify. Now, you've got some bigger organizations. I work with African parks in different countries. So that's a nonprofit, and they're much bigger, right? They take a systems-based approach. They, at this point, I think, look after about 17 parks in 11 different countries around Africa. And they get financing from the EU, for example. So even though they would try to ensure that a lot of the parks can pay for themselves through tourism, I don't think they will be as immediately in trouble right now as the more grassroots organizations who might not have money for more than a month or two, and then if nothing comes in, then that's it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay.
So yeah. Back to some of photography. Do you ever use your cell phone for pictures? Are you shooting with your cell phone like the rest of us?
Not for those kind of pictures. I do take selfies. it's hard to do that with an SLR. No, and I do a little bit of filming with it because it's just, you know, it's easier than filming with an SLR. And if the weather is really bad and I don't want to pull the big cameras out in the rain, so I use it for documentation for myself, to remember things as well. So I might photograph signs and, you know, with the path splits if I don't want to get lost and things like that. But no, I wouldn't normally use it for publications, for example.
Okay. Is there any particular species that you prefer to photograph? Do you have a favorite animal?
Well, to photograph, yeah, I don't know, but spending time with, I think it's very, very hard to do better than gorillas, right? The great apes are it is something different to be spending time with animals whose intelligence are, you know, not at our level, but still, you know, if you're looking at lions or zebras, it's really fun. But it's, you know, you are looking at them, right? If you spend time with a family of gorillas, they are just as interested in you a lot of the time as you are in them, and that's very special. And I mean, chimpanzees would be the same, but they aren't as relaxed, as close to people. So it's more relaxing for you to look at gorillas. So yeah, gorillas are incredible.
This is a bit more about technique and cropping. How do you, are the pictures we're seeing here, are these the pictures that you saw, or are they cropped in, in production afterwards?
Well, those two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, right? Because if my lens only extends so far, I might have seen a picture that I can't take because I can't get closer to the animal, so I might have to crop it later. But yeah, of course, sometimes you realize afterwards that, oh, actually tightening this a little bit would have helped. I've tended to err on the side of caution a little bit, so I'd rather zoom out a little bit more, just in case I don't get it straight enough, or I missed a small detail in a corner that I have a little bit of freedom to fix that later, especially if you're using cameras that are very high resolution, and then you don't need to worry about losing 10% of the frame.
All right, that was all that we had time for. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This event is part of a series of digital events produced by the Times to help our readers understand and navigate the world we find ourselves in today. If you're looking for a little exercise inspiration, today at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, Olympian Alexei Pappas will go running in place and talk about some of her strategies for staying in shape. And you can find out more about that event and all of our upcoming events at timesevents.nytimes.com. And thank you to our subscribers. You make our work possible. We look forward to seeing you again. And Marcus, thank you so much for taking part in this today.
No, my pleasure. And I will just add quickly, because I see there's a lot more questions. So what I'll do is I'll try to answer some of these in a blog post on my website. So anyone who hasn't had their question answered, I can't answer all of them, but I'll make a post with 20 or 30 questions and over the next few days, and try to answer as many as I can.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.